Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Russia is promising a tough response after being caught flat-footed by Ukraine.
In the gravest of challenges for Vladimir Putin, Ukrainian troops appear to raise their flag over Russian territory.
How did this happen, and what does it tell us about the state of the war? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. Ukraine is playing a new role in its war with Russia. It sent troops into Russia's Kursk region, just across the border in southwestern Russia.
Moscow said it sent reserves to repel hundreds of Ukrainian fighters and tanks that crossed into its territory. Ukraine's largest ground incursion into Russian territory since the war in Ukraine began.
And now, Russia has been forced to evacuate more than 76,000 residents from the region. It's also scrambling to get troops in to match this Ukrainian offensive.
My name's Alex Gatopoulos. I'm a defense editor for Al Jazeera English TV, and I live and work here in Doha in Qatar.
So, Alex, we throw around the term sneak attack a lot, but this Ukrainian incursion into Russia seems to have surprised absolutely everyone, including Vladimir Putin. So this first started on Tuesday, which is a week ago, and the Russians are seemingly still flummoxed by it. Can you walk us through what happened, where this is happening, and what you think the strategy was to start?
Well, this started out as a raid, a cross-border raid in force. This had happened before in Belgorod over a year ago, where they had units inside basically sabotaging and creating havoc. This was a similar raid, comprised of a few hundred people, so roughly about half a battalion, I want to use military speak, several dozen vehicles, some tanks, and they went in using electronic warfare, jamming Russian drones, using their own drones to great effect. And then when they destroyed targets, they would move the electronic jamming up to the next step. So it's this leapfrog way of approaching in powerful use of drones and electronic jamming and electronic warfare to advance. And they advanced really quickly. And they were surprised, I think, at their own success. And I think a few days later, when there hadn't been the response they quite wanted, Ukraine has been looking to try and draw Russian forces away from the meat grinder in Donetsk. A meat grinder that, by the way, Ukraine is losing, gradually. And they needed to do something, A, to boost morale, B, to try and change the narrative, and C, to try and divert Russian forces away from what is their main effort.
So maybe sometimes the best defense is a good offense.
Very much so.
This could not be more significant. I mean, the first time since World War II that part of Russia is under foreign control. We're already seeing the response by Russia. 2 people were killed in a Russian air attack outside Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Alex, what will you be looking out for in terms of Russia's response in the coming days?
Russia's tried to contain it propaganda-wise. They've called it an anti-terrorist operation, which means that it's a fairly low-level thing. It's not a huge military response. They can't call it an invasion. But it is very obvious to anyone who is in contact with any kind of social media when they're seeing pictures of Russians being evacuated. There are 2 regions now within Kursk where evacuations have been ordered.
Videos posted on social media show people packing their belongings, as well as long lines of cars as they try to flee the fighting.
And one region in neighboring Belgorod, there where evacuations have been ordered.
People are stocking up on emergency supplies, and many are volunteering to donate blood.
So these people have been pulled back. They've got the usual problems that the Ukrainians have been facing for 2 years of having to get away, taking all the stuff that they can carry with them, where they're going to go, or how they're going to be fed, who's going to look after them. Unfortunately, in war, it's always the civilians on both sides that suffer the most. And they've evacuated ahead of Ukrainian advances. But what we need to look out for now is going to be this boosting of Russian military capabilities there. What they're trying to do now is stem the tide of the Ukrainian advance. They're trying to dig trenches, build fortifications as quickly as they can, because they know that Russian troops, it plays to their strengths. Defense in depths, lines and lines and lines of trenches that you saw in the south of Ukraine, you saw in the east, that really blunted any kind of Ukrainian advance because they just didn't have the means to be able to keep punching through like defenses after defenses after defenses. It just got to the stage where their own offense got ground down, and then they stopped, and then of course it was the Russians' turn. So this is very important for Russia to build these as quickly as possible. They're big spaces, by the way, so it's going to have to be a lot of fortifications, and they need to get the troops up there. They need to get the troops up there without denuding their own forces in Donetsk. And that's really going to be the trick.
Alex, I wonder if we can step back a bit because, as you well know, this has been a very busy summer. And Ukraine has been on the back burner a bit. So maybe you can get us up to speed on the larger state of the war. And I'd love to know what you think the biggest challenge that each of these sides are facing at the moment in terms of winning the war.
The main area of focus has been the East. And the war in the East plays to Russia's strengths. Now, these are a larger armed force, and also a relative disregard for higher casualties. So in other words, they can afford to grind the Ukrainians down because they know eventually if they keep at it, Ukrainian forces, well, are limited. You know, there's a limit to how many people they can afford to have killed before they start to, their morale falls through the floor. They start to retreat and push back. And what the Ukrainians, they have defensive positions behind them that they can fall back to, but they don't have them in any way that layered depth that Russia had and Russia built in 2023. So there is a danger there that if Ukrainian forces collapse, then Russia will break into open country. Now, how far they can get, because the Russians tend to be not very good at the advance either. They tend to run out of fuel, ammunition, food, and just about everything very, very quickly, as we saw at the very beginning of the invasion. Any advance needs to keep pace with their logistics, which are old-fashioned, clumsy, and very much focused on the railway system, by the way. So you could almost superimpose a map of the railway system in Ukraine, and suddenly you get a more nuanced picture of what the Russians are trying to do because they have to advance along rail lines somehow.
Is the Ukrainian military planning on permanently occupying Russia? That's after the break. So, Alex, is it fair to say that the area where the Ukrainians are struggling the most is in the Donbass, and that the hope would have been that some of the troops that Russia brings in to reinforce themselves in Russia come from that Donbass region, and that frees them up a little bit in that area?
It does, but it's bigger than that. They've already used a lot of these troops up in the Donbass, and casualties have been really, really high as well. Ukraine tried its counteroffensive over in the south, crossing the Dnipro River. That didn't fare too well.
Ukrainian forces landed up to 7 boats, each carrying around 6 to 7 people on the east bank of the Dnipro.
The Russians saw them coming. They had made, obviously, any potential advance by the Ukrainians or river crossing very tricky by blowing the Kakhovka Dam.
A dam breach in the Russian-held area of Ukraine has sparked a growing humanitarian and environmental emergency, with flooding impacting dozens of towns and villages. The catastrophe is also...
And you saw the mass flooding as well in all these mud flats, which made advances that much more complex. And then they positioned battle-hardened kind of airborne troops who waiting for them as well. So the Ukrainians have had a tough time of it, a really tough time of it. And it's still the case that shell for shell, artillery for artillery, Russia is outgunning Ukraine by a factor of about 5 to 1. So every 5 shells Russia fires, Ukraine fires 1.
So the challenges for Ukraine are pretty well documented. It's manpower and it's weapons. The challenges for Russia, I'm a little more interested in your opinion on, is Is there a chance that this could damage Vladimir Putin's reputation, that this will be embarrassing enough to bring the war home to Russians who maybe haven't been paying much attention?
The incursion, absolutely so. And I would say this will probably have the biggest impact. Militarily, it seems very exciting, and there's this advance and, there's movement finally, rather than this kind of positional, static, attritional warfare. But it's still tiny. We're talking really small numbers here. A few thousand on each side compared to the high tens of thousands that are facing each other in Donetsk. But the impact on President Vladimir Putin is being huge. He could have brushed off a raid in force. If it had been a raid, say, lasting a few hours, a day and a half, fine. But for them to be still there a week later on Russian soil, rampaging up and down, without the Russians being able to drive them back, is bad news and makes him look incredibly weak. And this is a presidency that is based on strength, on him looking strong, on him being able to basically overcome just about anybody and anything and survive.
The enemy will certainly receive a worthy response, and all the goals that lie ahead of us, without any doubt, will be achieved.
Now, in what way can Russia drive the Ukrainians back? Well, they're going to have to denude some of their forces from Donetsk at some stage, which is exactly what Ukraine wants. Ukraine's got some hard choices too here, by the way. To stay and be defeated, you lose all the morale that you may have won in the population. Suddenly a victory is a defeat, and morale drops accordingly. And also you've lost men and lost vehicles, which could have been used in the defense of Donetsk. So, is this just a waste of time, a fruitless flourish? If in order to be able to hold on to the territory, you've got another problem as well, because Ukraine's going to have to commit more forces. And these forces, it's also short of troops and tanks and materiel. So they will have to commit forces. Russia will commit forces in opposition. And what you could end up having is a meat grinder 2.0 operation going on in Kursk as well as Donetsk. This is something that Ukraine will ultimately lose.
So in terms of what Ukraine does next, if I gave you three options, one is that Ukraine keeps pushing forward into Russia. Two, they retreat to a more defensible position. Or three, they just fall back to Ukraine. Which do you think is the most likely?
Yeah, this is a good point. I think Ukraine advancing too far into Russia is a danger. Okay, like everyone else that has advanced too far into Russia. It's all very exciting and victory seems assured, but Russia's a big place and they've got lots of, they just keep retreating. And sooner or later, their supply lines will be destroyed. So I don't think they'll do that. Do they want to be able to keep some terrain, to be able to negotiate in a peace negotiation in the future, in a peace deal? Sure, that's a huge help. They'll have something at least with which to trade, because at the moment they don't have anything. They've got nothing to trade, right? Now they would do if they can hang on to it, but it's the hanging on to it that's going to be tricky. Russia can't be everywhere, but neither can Ukraine.
So I guess that leads into our final question. How long can both of these armies keep this up? I mean, at what point does this war assure mutual assured destruction for both of these militaries? And I guess, is it possible that we're already at that point?
In a way, morale-wise, it always favors the defender, because for the attacker, that's Hill 246. For the defender, that's home. So it always, in terms of morale, you are far more likely to fight more given everything else being even, you're going to fight more intensely for your own home than you will for some adventure which you certainly weren't consulted about and were drafted in, and then you find yourself there fighting pretty much for your life. So I would say morale favors Ukraine, but sooner or later, I mean, that pool is, okay, Ukraine was a pre-war population of about, 40 million, Russia about 140 million. That's a definite difference in size and demographic. But ultimately, it's conscripts fighting conscripts, right? There's most people drafted in with minimal training, and that has the potential to exhaust everyone after a while. But I think everyone is keeping an eye on the elections in the United States the support for Ukraine is waning. We can see it. Waning amongst Democrats, waning amongst Republicans, waning amongst Europeans. Everybody's a bit exhausted of it all. It seems insatiable. There comes a point where they said there's a limit to what we can give you. I mean, yes, we're giving you our second-tier stuff and saving the best for ourselves. However, we still don't have bottomless pockets, you know. And also, of course, now that Russia has increasing help from Iran, increasing help from North Korea, possible help for the ammunition from Vietnam, possible more military help from China, which is already supplying it with precursor chemicals like saltpeter to be able to boost its explosives industry. So you have a lot of people helping Russia now, which is not devoid of help itself. It's a big country full of resources. And yes, there comes a point when both sides will fight each other to exhaustion at some stage. I don't think it's now, but at some stage it will happen. It's got to end sometime.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Khaled Soltan and Chloe K. Lee, with Amy Walters, Duha Mosaad, Manahil Naveed, Veronica Shaya, and me, Kevin Hirten, in for Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.